Howdy, my name is Casey Davis, and again, I just want to thank you for watching my educational videos. It was brought to my attention that a recommendation from my first segment, using atrazine for annual bluegrass control, had not been effective. Good news, there are other options. For pre-emergent control, benefin, prodiamine, or simazine all have an excellent rating for control, but so does atrazine. So just gotta, trial and error there. Post-emergent control options, forum sulfuron, trifloxysulfuron, or simazine. Now, I'm only somewhat familiar with the prodiamine and the simazine, so if you use any other ones, just be sure to familiarize yourself with whichever product you use. Make sure it's safe to use on your specific lawn type. One other discovery made after the first video was that Dichondra can vary greatly in size, and this picture doesn't really do it justice. The leaves in the left picture were up to about a $1/2 size, while the leaf on the right was just about the size of my fingernail. All right, so moving on to segment 2, the plants discussed in this segment all have a look-alike or sound-alike to them. These are wild onion and wild garlic. They are almost indistinguishable from each other. Ball and white clover, they look pretty much just alike except for the size of the bloom. Crimson clover and red clover, which really only have similar names, they're very distinguishable from each other. Common and hairy vetch, both of those are good winter forages. Texas toadflax and Lyreleaf sage, both of which are considered wildflowers rather than any kind of nuisance species. So, like I did before we get into the details about each plant, I just want to remind you about some terms. So, cool season versus warm season. A cool season crop is one that emerges, of course, in the cool season. The actual dates can vary, but about January to March is typical for when they emerge. But of course, it does depend on the specific plant, the geographic location, things like that. Some plants could emerge as early as November or December. A warm season crop is one that emerges in late spring and grows throughout the summer into fall. Again, specific dates will vary based on the actual crop and where you're located. Okay, perennial versus annual versus biennial. Again, that perennial returns year after year. An annual must be reseeded every year in order to return. And a biennial is going to stick around for about 2 years and will survive through 2 growing seasons. Broadleaf versus grassy. Of course, the broadleaf, if it has leaves, it's probably a broadleaf plant. If it has grass blades, most likely a grassy weed. Pesticide use. I always give a disclaimer whenever discussing pesticide recommendations. Always consult your county extension agent before following a recommendation that you find elsewhere or online. And this is because restrictions and pesticide legality, of course, can vary across different states and regions. Always read the label, even if you've already been given instruction by your county extension agent. And that goes to say always follow label guidelines, mixing instructions, and personal protective equipment recommendations and requirements. Why is it so important? Labels can change from year to year. An old label from the exact same product may have slightly different information than a new product. They may be formulated a little bit differently, be at a higher rate or a lower rate. Lastly, some grasses are more sensitive to certain herbicides, so another reason to read that label, make sure the product you're using is safe or recommended for using on your type of turf, lawn, pasture, etc. So again, the reason I am showing video in the field rather than a presentation, let's say just with pictures, is to help you have a better perspective of the plants in question and help you identify what may be hiding in your own yard or pasture. Wild onion and wild garlic. Pictured and videoed here is wild onion. Both are bulbous perennial herbs in the lily family, and both have white flowers arranged in a terminal cluster, which is at the top of the plant. Wild onion has flat to concave solid leaves, while wild garlic has round hollow leaves. That's actually the best way to determine the difference between them. Wild onion is about 6 to 20 inches high, wild garlic probably about the same. Wild onion is widely distributed across the U.S., adapted to every soil type and more common in lawns, whereas wild garlic is more difficult to control and is a problem in cultivated crops and maintained nursery stock. Wild onion is spread by seed. Wild onion contains an agent toxic to livestock, but typically only when it's consumed in very large quantities, so not normally an issue. But some of those symptoms include jaundice, depression, anorexia, weakness, dark red or brown urine, and they'll also contain a strong oniony or garlicky odor on their breath. Now, the only thing I've seen noted about wild garlic is that milk from cows that consume it will have an off taste. Control options for both wild onion and wild garlic are relatively the same. And for wild onion, mechanical control is not necessarily recommended because it can be difficult to get the entire plant, including that bulb and root system. But if you keep a well-managed, dense lawn, it will slow the growth. And garlic mechanical control, hoeing throughout the winter and early spring, will prevent development of new underground bulbs. Chemical control probably also warranted though. So chemical control for both of them. Pre-emergent, not necessarily recommended, but a post-emergent control, a 3-way mix of a product containing 2,4-D, MCPP, and dicamba, or MCPP, clopyralid, and triclopyr is recommended. The difference here is going to be which products are recommended for you to use in your desired crop or lawn. So that first 3-way mix is going to be more desirable in one situation, and the second 3-way mix may be more desirable in another situation. So again, always read that label. Ball clover and white clover. These two are almost indistinguishable if you're not looking at them side by side. There are also different varieties of white clover. However, they're both cool season legumes. So ball clover is an annual with non-hairy oval leaflets, toothed margins, small seed heads, and they're smaller than white clover. It has fragrant white flowers. Ball clover is adapted to loam to clay soils and tolerates poor drainage, but it doesn't do as well in wet areas as white clover would. It thrives in a wider pH range, though, than white clover does. Both are preferred cover crops for in between the cool season to warm season grazing period. Ball clover will tolerate heavy grazing. Control options for ball clover, not necessarily considered a nuisance, but in those certain circumstances where it's in a pasture and competing with the warm season forage for sunlight and getting that warm season grass to emerge, then a broadleaf herbicide containing 2,4-D will control pretty much all clover varieties after they have emerged. So white clover is a perennial in nature. Of course, in Texas, it generally acts more as a reseeding annual. It is much more tolerant of poorly drained soils and clayey soils than most legumes. And actually, a fun fact, Texas A&M AgriLife Research Center at Overton developed their own variety known as Natchez white clover, and it's really common to use for grazing. Crimson and red clover. So these two clover varieties are really only similar in their titles, which is why it is important to call them by their correct name. So crimson clover has a true deep red crimson floret as well as that elongated shape of that floret. Red clover has a more fuchsia to pink floret that is round. So crimson clover is a cool season annual, has that distinct seed head known as a rosette that forms the crimson floret. Leaves are round tipped and contain hair on the stems and leaves. It is a legume, of course they both are. Crimson clover is adapted to poor quality soils, sandy or clay soils. It is often used as a pollinator in silage mixes or as a winter cover crop for soil protection or grazing. Control options for crimson clover, not necessarily considered a nuisance, but again, if it's competing for that warm season forage and preventing it from emerging, then we want to use a broadleaf control with 2,4-D in it. Should be effective. Crimson clover will also die out in the heat of the Texas summers. Red clover, now it's a short-lived plant and of course acts as an annual in Texas. It has a later maturity date than other legumes, so that can definitely be an issue competing with warm season grass or forage for sunlight. Common and hairy vetch. These two are both cool season annual legumes. Both can be utilized as grazing in the cool season. However, hairy vetch is more widely adapted throughout the South. Both hairy and common vetch are more tolerant of acidic soils than other legumes. Hairy vetch is more tolerant of poorly drained soils and is more cold tolerant than common vetch. Both have a trailing or climbing growth habit. Both may be used as a cover crop, although hairy vetch is more commonly used. They are nitrogen fixers in the soil, just like most clovers are, and it will improve the nutritive value of early spring forage, again, just like other legumes. So there are more vetch varieties than just these two, but these were the two that are most commonly seen in our region, two that I've seen, at least in my pasture on the side of the road, things like that. So common vetch, the leaves are pinnately compound, meaning they have a row of leaflets that form on both sides of an extension of the petiole. Flowers may vary in color by the specific species: white, blue, lavender, pink, purple, or even bicolored. Most of the common vetch I've seen has more of a deep pink color. From what I can tell, common vetch does not have the soft woolly fuzz on its stems and leaves that hairy vetch does, or at least not nearly as distinct as hairy vetch does. Common vetch can be more of an invasive species. Post-emergent control options, if it has become invasive or, again, is inhibiting the growth of warm season forage, would be clopyralid for most pasture grass varieties and a sulfentrazone plus prodiamine mix for most lawn varieties. Hairy vetch. The leaves are also pinnately compound and have about 12 to 20 leaflets and leaves that terminate with tendrils. Stems and leaves are covered with a soft woolly fuzz. It's very distinguishable on there. Cattle grazing on pure stands of hairy vetch can develop dermatitis or inflammation of the skin, similar to a photosensitization, but it doesn't seem to be a problem where adequate grass was also available. All right, for control, if it needs to be terminated in a pasture, again, to get that warm season forage emerging, broadleaf herbicide such as 2,4-D is going to work on that as well. Texas toadflax and Lyreleaf sage. Now these are just pretty. These two are only similar in appearance of their blooms, and when observed side by side, it's pretty clear that they're two different species. So in fact, Texas toadflax is in the figwort family, while Lyreleaf sage is in the mint family. Neither seem to be considered invasive. Again, they're just pretty. So Texas toadflax is a cool season annual herb. It grows about 1 to 3 feet tall. It has a basal leaf rosette, stems and leaves that are hairless. The non-flowering stems grow sideways close to the ground. It has a unique bloom, a two-lipped violet to pale blue flower atop the tall stalks that blooms between February and May. It is common in most sandy soils, open woods, and grassy pinelands. It's considered a delicate addition to the woodland garden. It is a butterfly attractant, a nectar source, and is native to the southern United States. Lyreleaf sage. It is strictly upright and is a hairy perennial. It grows only about 1 to 2 feet tall. It also has a basal rosette of leaves, but the leaves are deeply lobed, with a few simple leaves higher up on the stem. The large basal leaves at the bottom usually have a purple tinge in the winter. It has square stems. It has pale blue to violet tubular flowers arranged in whorls around the stem, forming a terminal spike. Each blossom or bloom is about 1 inch long, which is slightly larger than the Texas toadflax blooms. This makes a great ground cover, is also adapted to loose sandy soils. It's a great pollinator, butterfly attractant, and is also native to the U.S. This concludes segment 2. Be sure to tune in next week. We've got some really exciting plants. We're going to talk about thistles, which are fairly common. People know those, but there's some other really interesting ones coming up. So be sure to tune in.